Welcome, everyone. Manu, as you heard, is an extremely popular, well-read historian, but pretends like he behaves like a first-time author. Yesterday he said, I don't know if anyone's going to come, and we have a queue down the plaza. He didn't have a copy of his book, so we had to go and send it. So I'm going to put it up on display, so it's ingrained in your subconscious. So you go out and buy a copy and get him to sign it, and if you don't buy a copy today, you get it another day. But so we're going to really, as you can see, it's a tome. Every time Manu publishes a book, I buy a copy and then I don't read it because I want to read it, but I never get around to reading it. So I'm very grateful that this time I had an opportunity, I had to read it, right? Which was brilliant because I knew I would enjoy reading it, which is why I buy the books. And I've learned an enormous amount reading it. As a Hindu, as a modern Indian, as somebody who thinks about democracy and Indian politics all the time, it's immensely rewarding to get this historical scholarship behind it. So I want to really start, Manu, with the subtitle of your book, The Making of a Modern Hindu Identity. Because clearly you've been thinking about this a long time, but the modern Hindu identity in today's world is significant in a way that it's probably never been before. So there is the Hinduism as one of the world's religions is widely known. Many of you know it exists. But there's something about the modernity of its current form that has been shaped by very particular historical processes. And that's so you tell us very clearly at the start and through the book what it's not. So if you're looking for a book on ancient Hinduism or of the Vedas, this is not the book for it. This is a historian's book about the last 400 years, when there's been a series of encounters encapsulated in that wonderful title, Gods, Guns, and Missionaries. It's an evocation of, what's it? God, germs, and steel.
It is not an evocation of that book.
Right, which worked. I hope it works as well as that title did, but it's not an evocation of, the argument certainly isn't, that's true. So start by telling us why the last 400 years is what you chose to focus on, and what is peculiarly modern about it.
You know, growing up, all of us have a certain sense of our respective religions, right? Where you imagine that all of these religions emerged completely formed and well-shaped and perfectly defined, and we've just been following this for the last 1,000 years, and everyone for the last 1,000 years has been doing the same thing. We like the idea of religion being this constant that doesn't really change. Whereas the more I read about Hinduism, and of course other religions also, they're constantly adapting, they're constantly shape-shifting because of culture, politics, economic trends, and so on. Religions die, they fade out, they come back into fashion. At different epochs and different times in history, they take new avatars and acquire new faces, which is why we've got this triple-headed cover, because this is the face you see of Hinduism in the modern period, but this may not be the face that existed earlier, and it may not be the face that emerges in future, because religions also have a way of rebranding and recataloguing and packaging themselves over a period of time. And I think that dynamic nature of religion interested me, especially where politics intersects with identity. Identity is also a very political commodity. People assert identity partly not just because they're convinced about a certain God, but because they're making a political statement by asserting that identity. Now, religion itself being dynamic isn't surprising, and that still happens. One story I love telling, and people who came for my last London talk would have heard this, is about how I come from the state of Kerala in India, where I was born in Alleppey district. And we have over there a temple to a deity called Murugan. And some years ago, about 10 or 15 years ago, the story goes that there was a young boy who was unwell, a Muslim boy in some accounts, and his parents were told that they need to take this boy to the temple and make a ritual offering in the temple. The ritual offering is usually, certain traditional things, a banana, this, that, whatever it is. But this kid apparently also had a Munch chocolate with him. Munch is a particular brand of chocolate. And he offered Munch chocolate as well, in addition to the ritual elements to the deity, and he was cured by the morning. His fever vanished, etc., etc. Since then, this particular deity is called Munch Murugan, and everybody now makes offerings of Munch chocolate to this god. The god is offered garlands made of Munch chocolate. It can't be any other chocolate. It has to be Munch chocolate. And we have this thing called the Tulabharam, where you weigh yourself against, say, grain or coconuts or whatever, and you donate that to the temple. People do that with Munch chocolate. So, and this happened in the last 15 years. They give it as prasadam as well, back to the devotees. They do puja to it and then they return it to the devotees. And this is true of multiple places. At a more serious level, my own family temple, my mother's family, they have a private temple of their own. And we've got gods that come from different caste backgrounds. We've got vegetarian deities, non-vegetarian deities, deities that required blood sacrifices, deities that were bathed in milk. And over various historical periods, due to various historical contingencies, they've all ended up in the same shared space. And Hinduism, for its long arc, was essentially about a shared framework. Unlike religions of the West, unlike Islam or Christianity, which have a core book, there's a prophet, there are some very defined concepts at the base. Hinduism, in many ways, is not really one book or one set of practices. It is a diversity of practices, but occupying a shared fabric. And the analogy I have in the introduction of the book is that initially it was like a tapestry being woven continuously, a shapeless tapestry. Everybody was adding their own weaves. There were fresh colors coming in. The thing had no general shape or outline to it. But something in the last 400 years, which is colonialism, interaction with European missionaries, interaction with the idea of Christianity, and a new mold of religion, of what a religion ought to look like, meant that there was the rise of what would also ultimately become Hindu nationalism, a sense of identity, and a stitching up of those outer borders. Where earlier the fabric was expanding, drawing in all kinds of cults. We've got goddesses who menstruate. We've got, as I said, non-vegetarian deities. You've got these great monotheistic ideas, but you also have a polytheistic infrastructure where for different purposes you go to different gods. Sometimes the barrier between religions isn't entirely clear. So if you go to the great temple of Sabrimala again in Kerala, you first need to go to the mosque of Vavar and pay your respects there, and then go to the temple of Sabrimala. As recently as 50 years ago, for any oil or ghee to go into a Hindu temple in Kerala, you needed a Syrian Christian to touch it, to purify it. So even Christians are in some ways woven into these fabrics. And in fact, at one point when the Hindus interacted or came across Islam, they even tried to give Islam a Hindu origin, saying that it was actually Lord Shiva who gave the Prophet Muhammad permission to set up a new religion. So we've definitely tried to absorb Christianity and Islam as well at certain points in our history. So it is that weaving of the outer border, the realization that in a world of competing faiths and in a time of colonialism where power is in the hands of the white man, the only way you can in some ways hold on to your identity is by giving it a muscular avatar, and that muscular avatar requires a ring fencing, a sort of harder, harsher, more rigid idea of religion to emerge.
Great. Okay, so at this point, Hinduism sounds inclusive, adaptable, plastic, is able to take in everything from Munch chocolates to Syrian Christians, right? Which is the liberal view of Hinduism. Shashi Tharoor, whom we both know, wrote Why I'm a Hindu in that vein. And yet, of course, the context in 2024 of your book being published at the moment, 25, there is this hardening of the borders has also led to a political ideology of Hinduism in politics called Hindutva, for people who may not be familiar with the term, and Manu can tell you more. Clearly, your attempt at outlining the last 400 years is also to show us how this flexibility of Hinduism can harden not only the boundaries, but also a political ideology that can have a majoritarian worldview in a democratic politics, that can be anti-minority. There is no accommodation of mosques and priests. That Hindutva, is that really what you're trying to understand? Because you end the book, of course, with the ideologues of Hindutva and Savarkar. So would you make a sharp distinction between the sort of rather progressive, almost touchy-feely Hinduism you just started by talking about, and Hindutva?
The book isn't about Hindutva, and that was a conscious decision because I think there's a bit of presentism in the fact that because we are living in the age of Hindu nationalism, we view everything through its prism. Hindu nationalism is a consequence of Hinduism's modernization, the rise of nationalism in general, colonialism, all of that, but it is not the consequence, which is that I will not reduce all of modern Hinduism to Hindutva. Hindutva is one element that has emerged, but modern Hinduism is still a fairly complex process. Even now, there are people who go to those Muslim shrines who have no issues participating in the faiths of other religions, etc. And that sort of porosity still exists. But yes, there is now, of course, Hindu nationalism, which attempts a regimentation and attempts to create one version, a homogenized kind of Hinduism. So that's definitely true. The question is, why does Hindu nationalism emerge? It never convinced me completely that someone in the 20th century woke up and just wrote a book, Savarkar wrote a book on Hindu nationalism, and that was the fount of Hindu nationalism from that time. Obviously, he vocalized and articulated something that was already bubbling around. He gave it its sharpest face, but it wasn't an invention out of thin air. Something was still bubbling up, which led me to ask, where was the original impulse for Hindus to assert a muscular or a slightly politicized identity? There was some kind of development of that identity in the initial encounters with Islam. Not Islam as a religion, but Islamic power. Because Islam as a religion came to South India very much, if tradition is to be believed, in the lifetime of the Prophet himself. In fact, again, in my home state of Kerala, our founding political legend is about a Hindu king watching the moon being split, hearing about the Prophet's miracle, and then taking a ship to Mecca and converting to Islam. So that's Kerala's founding political legend. The Muslims who came to Kerala set up mosques that looked exactly like the Hindu temples that existed in the area. They became part of the local cultural fabric. They became matrilineal because the upper caste Hindus in Kerala were matrilineal, so the Muslims also became matrilineal. So they sort of became part of the local ecosystem. But when it was Islamic power that came in northern India on the back of armies and a different group of people coming in from the outside, I think that is where you see the initial seeds of a kind of Hindu response that eventually becomes more and more muscular. So already in 1347, you have these emperors in South India called the Kings of Vijayanagara, who have this special title called Hindu Raya Suratrana, which is sultans among Hindu kings, where they've appropriated the Muslim title of sultan, but they're still distinguishing themselves as sultans among Hindu kings. And it's, as of now, the first example of Hindus using the word Hindu consciously to define themselves against another set of people. You look at the poetry of these figures like Kabir. He draws a clear distinction, or he sees two broad groups in India, which is the Turk or the Turk, equal to the Muslim, and the Hindu or the rest of the mass. You see Mughal paintings, and you see that the Hindu nobles all tie their jama one way, the Muslims tie it another way. So there's some sense that there are these two fuzzy categories, but that fuzziness is what starts vanishing in the modern period. And there it's not really interaction with Muslims, because that happens, of course, into the 20th century, etc. Very well studied. You know a lot about that. But I think colonialism and the presence of the missionary and the presence of the white man actually gives these modern Hindus who are anxious about reshaping their religion the framework with which to operate. And it's ironic because on the one hand, they reject Christianity, they reject colonial power, but they borrow tools from the same toolkit in order to assert their identity in a new way.
So this, and what is fascinating about your book is in fact the mirroring between Hinduism and the colonial missionaries, or the missionaries during the colonial period. Like you say, they are borrowing a framework, a language of monotheism, everything else, but they are also shaping, in turn, the missionaries, which is fascinating, and we'll talk about people like Dinobili and so on, that you write about. But can I just pause and go back to Hinduism itself and its adaptability that you start the book with, for instance, with this wonderful anecdote. You may or may not, actually don't give it away because it's such a good anecdote. People will really need to go and buy the book.
I don't mind giving it away. It's actually good fun.
Okay. It is good fun, which is why they need to buy the book.
Manu, it's okay, we'll make them buy the book.
Yeah, let's make them buy the book. But what I wanted to ask you about, you talk about the adaptability of the Brahmin and the Brahmin consolidation over Hinduism, right? And then you, towards the end of the book, come back, quite rightly, to the Dalit challenge to Hinduism and people like Jyotirao Phule and so on. Can you say something a little bit about that flexibility that is inherent in Hinduism as a religion, but also a flexibility that allows the elite, the Brahmins, to maintain their supremacy and maintain the caste system, which continues to exist in Hindu society everywhere. apart from Cambodia, which, of course, Willie's been writing about in The Golden Road. That seems to me the ideal version of Hinduism in many senses. It's got all the attributes and the biggest temple to Hinduism in Angkor Wat, but no caste. But that's a different story. Can you talk about the story of caste and Brahmin consolidation?
So, of course, Hinduism is a very pluralistic tradition. But at the same time, we must watch against romanticizing it. Of course, there are elements to it which are quite interesting, and it's quite fascinating to study it. But you also then ask the question, Brahmins are essentially the top of the caste ladder, and you find that Brahmin culture fans out from northern India into the peninsula, into the east, towards the west, etc. And as these Brahmin communities are traveling into these places, they're taking their religious ideas, their holy texts, the Vedas, all of that into these cultures, into these zones, often tribal zones. But at the same time, they're also absorbing elements that are highly local in nature. So, for example, we know of communities of Brahmins today who were originally tribal priests who were upgraded as Brahmins in some kind of local compromise. We have temples where one puja or one set of worship rituals will be performed at a certain time of the day by Brahmins, and then the other set of rituals will be performed by non-Brahmin local priests with a completely different set of ceremonies. Because it's all, again, some kind of understanding that's been reached that both of these groups have a claim over this site. While they were doing this, that's why when Brahmins said, or we believe that it's very pluralistic and it's got multiple systems within the Hindu fabric, the idea is that you are absorbing multiple elements, but the Brahmins, while absorbing it, did not ever claim that these were all equal ways or equal paths. They created at the same time a kind of hierarchy, which is why in Hinduism we have high caste gods and lower or so-called inferior gods. The gods who consume milk and honey are considered higher than the gods who require blood and alcohol and meat. Sometimes, of course, there's conflict, but broadly, there is a hierarchy that's always at the center of this. And I think that's also why some of that pluralism was able to exist, because in creating the framework, they accepted everything, created room for everything, but then they also created a cataloging system where some things were purer and some things were less pure. So it's one of those double-edged things where you have the multiple, but not everybody is equal. So it's more equilibrium, not so much equality. And that is also very much linked to the caste system about how human beings are also, everyone has their slot, but not everybody can ever be equal in any society. That's the orthodox view. And even the Hindu nationalists like Tilak grappled with this a great deal. They were very unwilling to accept the idea that all human beings could be the same. Necessarily, there were going to be class or caste-based differences, and that was also legitimate. And even now, I think caste remains the biggest fragility for Hindu nationalism in India, which is that in wanting to create a homogenized Hindu political identity, you want everybody to identify as Hindus, but you also don't want to give up your caste-based, very special identity or sub-identities, and people are very attached to it. On the anecdote that you mentioned, that's on the adaptability of Hinduism. This isn't the story in the book. I'll tell you about that, but it's also about everyday life. When my father passed away in 2019, I was told that every month I'd have to go and perform a certain ritual at the temple or wherever we'd immersed his ashes and all of that. And I said, look, this is very far away. I'm not here all the time, so I don't think I can come on the exact date according to the Hindu calendar. At the same time, you need to go and perform these rituals. So the Brahmin said, oh, I understand. You're not here. You're not in the country. All of that. There's a compromise around this. You do one ritual now, and then come back a year later, and then we'll do all the 12 months together, and then we'll do a compensatory 13th month, and that'll be fine. Everything will be done. The story in the book begins with the story of the Maharaja of Mysore, of Jaipur, who in 1903 was invited to the coronation of the king here. And he was told that, as a good upper caste Hindu, you can't cross the black waters of the ocean. If you go abroad, you lose caste. Now, obviously, the Maharaja was very keen to go. He wanted to come to England and see London and all the sights. But he also didn't want to lose caste and upset people of a traditional mold of thinking. So what he did is he consulted all the Brahmins, and they said, okay, here's your way out. You have a personal deity called Sri Gopalji, a form of Krishna. It is Sri Gopalji who's making the trip to England. The Maharaja is a good devotee, and he's only following the image of Sri Gopalji to England. So what they do is the deity is taken out from the palace. He's brought to Bombay. They acquire a steamer that nobody's used, and therefore it's ritually undefiled. They get Brahmin priests to do all kinds of pujas over there. They look through all the old Puranic epics in India, and they discover that in the epic Ramayana, where Rama goes to fight the evil Ravana in Lanka, that's across the sea, right? So Rama apparently performs certain rituals by the seaside. So they apparently recreate those exact rituals for the Maharaja. He chucks golden coconuts and other things into the water as an offering to the sea gods. Because he's of course horrified by the idea of drinking English water, he brings 4 large urns, I think 3 large urns of water with sacred water from the Ganga, and this is brought onto the ship. Somewhere, I think, on the way, they encounter choppy waters and people tell them that the sea gods are upset. So then one of these urns is dropped as an offering to the sea god and they continue with their journey. He gets to England, and even in England, when he gets off at the train station, the image of Sri Gopalji, the god, is in the first carriage and the Rajas following in the second carriage because he has to constantly follow. And that's how, by following his deity, he manages to bypass this injunction around caste and come to England and meet the king and do all of those things. And the funniest bit in all of this is that once he was here, the coronation date was postponed because the king fell unwell. And in the official account written by a court chronicler, he says that the Maharaja prayed day and night to Sri Gopalji, and with the blessings of his deity, the King of England recovered. So the coronation of the Christian King of England only happened because Sri Gopalji from Jaipur happened to be in town on that particular, at that particular time. And again, this is a way to get past complicated corners. And this, I think, is also why we sometimes in India also have a strange relationship with history, which is that communities and people remember the past a certain way. We know of caste groups, for example, which began as highly anti-Vedic, highly anti-Brahminical, but in a few generations, they become co-opted into the system. And their successors then remember their own history in a different way. We have communities or we have sects in India which were very anti-Vedic, the Shaiva sects, very militantly anti-Brahminical. But then they, over a period of time, shift gears, and then retrospectively, there's an interpretation given that brings everything in line with the Brahminical order of things. So I think that creative capacity to keep jumping over complicated corners of social interactions or history, etc., that is also an integral part of Hinduism. And that's also, I suppose, one reason why figures like Savarkar, the father of Hindu nationalism in the 20th century, were able to interpret history in ways that suited them. Because at one point, I think he writes quite clearly that history is meant to serve you. You're not here to sort of be a consequence of history. Your interpretation of history is, you're asserting agency in a certain sense, and therefore you will constantly interpret and reinterpret history to create meaning for yourself in the present. And that's an interesting kind of thought process.
It is interesting, but it's also very risky for a historian to be saying this, who also self-identifies.
No, I didn't endorse it.
So you haven't just made up this 400-year history to suit your argument.
Well, I'm sure there are people on the right wing, in the right wing in India who do claim that anything I write is made up, but that's all right. We'll take that criticism, given that this is the quarter it comes from.
So let's get into the meat of the encounter between various different colonial actors. There's the East India Company, there are missionaries of the Catholic Church and outside it, and then eventually the colonial government. You periodize it in a particular way, and you call the different chapters different things. Can you give us a quick summary of what the periods are and what are their main characteristics, very briefly, because it's a long argument.
So it begins with the arrival of the Portuguese missionaries in Goa, along with Portuguese power. And Goa is just this very small little pocket on the coast where Europeans, quite early on, by the 1510s, they already have political authority. So this is where you really have Christianity coming in a certain way. Western Christianity. There were already Christians in India of the Persian church, which of course the Catholics didn't recognize. And they went out to persecute all the Nasrani Christians of India for being too Hinduized and not being Catholic enough.
Again in your state?
Yes, again in my state. So the Portuguese missionaries come in, and this is a phase when there's a lot of conflict because there is a push to not just Christianize people in Goa, but also to Europeanize them. So you need to give up your names, you need to give up your local cultural habits, you can't squat to urinate, you have to do it standing up, you can't wear slippers you can't take off your slippers when you enter homes as we do in India, you need to walk into your homes with your slippers on. So there's this kind of cultural Europeanization as well that the Portuguese attempt. So Christianity here is a very aggressive kind of phase. And there is persecution of Hindus in this phase. There are gods who are fleeing this place. People are running off with their various deities. They're of course taunting the Portuguese as well. They're finding ways of resisting the Portuguese. But there are even now communities that have those living memories of Portuguese persecution. But again, this was where European power coincided with the presence of the missionary. Equally, there were other pockets where the missionary would travel, and that's the other phase, the next phase, but these were Hindu-ruled areas. So the missionary couldn't push a Europeanization. On the contrary, Christianity becomes Hinduized in these places. So you mentioned earlier Roberto de Nobili, an Italian Jesuit, who comes off to South India, and he's in this temple town of Madurai, an outpost of the Vijayanagara Empire, a very Hindu place. And he realizes that along the coast, the only people who show any interest in conversion are lower caste, marginalized communities, like the fishing folks, etc. And he says, no, I want the cream of Hindu society. I want Brahmins to convert. This is also a time when, of course, Europeans and Hindus both have all kinds of stereotypes about each other. Europeans have this belief that Hindus are going around worshipping monsters because there's only one way to God, and that way is through Christianity and through the Bible. So if that is God, what all of these people are worshipping cannot be God. This is all satanic. These are all monsters. Hindus have their own stereotypes about the Portuguese, which is that these are white people who do not wash their bottoms after going to the toilet. So them coming and talking to us about civilizing the native is a bit rich. They also have these stories about how Europeans have all of them have the faces of pigs, and that they go to bed wrapping themselves up in their ears. So, they also believe that Europeans like to eat babies fried in butter. So both sides had their respective stereotypes. But Nobili realizes in Madurai or in South India and Tamil Nadu that he needs to make Christianity attractive to the Hindus. So unlike the Portuguese who are pushing Christianization, he has a much more diplomatic route, which is essentially he starts pretending to be a Brahmin. Like the upper caste Hindu Brahmin, he acquires a sacred thread around his torso. Like the upper caste Hindu Brahmin, he sits down on the floor and eats off a plantain leaf. Like the upper caste Hindu, he only eats food cooked by Brahmins, the highest caste available in the region. He also learns Tamil, he also learns Sanskrit, and he presents the Bible, which is now, the word he uses is Satya Vedam, the Veda of truth, saying that you've got the 4 Vedas of the Brahmins, this is the 5th Veda, this is the ultimate Veda. You found your way till here, let me show you the final mile, and this is how you're going to do it. And the result of this is that Christianity in southern India, Christianity in Goa is a very Europeanized Christianity. The names are European. But Christianity in Tamil Nadu is one where you can do goat sacrifices to Mother Mary or to Christian saints. It's a place where there are these processions for the Virgin, just as you have processions for Hindu goddesses. It's a place where the church fathers wear saffron robes, very much like Hindu hermits. They have this tika on their foreheads. They do puja with flames and fire, etc., like Hindus. And most importantly, they also appropriate caste. Because De Nobili also believes that, caste is a civil institution, so you don't need to meddle with caste. So in his church, the upper caste Christian converts get to sit in the front, the lower caste Christian converts have to sit at the back. To this day, there's something called Dalit Human Rights Watch. It's an organization which talks about how Catholics in southern India, Tamil Nadu, etc., to this day live with caste, where if you're lower caste Catholic, you have a separate cemetery, you're not allowed to participate in certain church activities, etc. So in this phase, it is Christianity that gets Hinduized. The next phase is, of course, where the Protestants enter, and the Protestant arrival also coincides with the rise of British power in India. Here again, it's not a simple story of empire, and I think that's a point I try to make in the book, which is that we have this, in Britain especially, it's very polarizing, right? Empire, one side of people believe that it's all railways and democracy and spreading wonderful things around the world. Another view is that it's the other extreme, that it was just oppression for morning, for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But the point is, the British initially, when they came into India, they didn't want to meddle with Hinduism either. So we first had a phase where the East India Company was not just tolerating Hinduism, but actively endorsing it. We have temples, some of the biggest temples in southern India, where you have endowments made by English figures. Thomas Munro's made an endowment at Tirupati, one of the richest temples in the world. Colonel John Munro made a gift of valuable jewels, etc., to the Padmanabha Swami temple in Trivandrum, which has a treasury with, for $18 billion worth of gold and gems, etc. In a place called Bhavani, you have a palanquin that's brought out, and they do, they worship the goddess in that palanquin. That was donated by an English officer. English company troops were leading Hindu gods in their processions, including goddesses who menstruate. Their menstrual baths and the processions around that were led by these Christian officers. They were actively participating in local culture and local society. And the Protestant missionaries weren't terribly happy about it because they were also barring Protestant activity in India. They didn't want missionaries to come in and create political trouble here. But then in Britain, you have a campaign where, because of the evangelical movement here, there's pressure on Parliament here to allow missionaries into India. They start pushing for missionary activity. They start pushing for the East India Company to support conversion, all of that. That's when the Protestant missionary enters and becomes far more of a threat. You have the Protestant missionary refusing to Indianize or Hinduize, now insisting that the Hindus need to be saved from their religions. You have people talking about how, the Hindu gods are all carnal and shameless, and, you've got Krishna dancing around with the gopis, in our epics. It says, how can this be God? God isn't flirtatious and romantic like this. You have Kali, for which all these songs are sung and goats are sacrificed. So they're saying, this can't be God. This is clearly some kind of monstrous figure. So they come in with a much more aggressive tone. And as a consequence of this, the Hindus, who hitherto were quite happy to deal with the British. In fact, when the British conquered Jagannath, where we have the famous temple of Puri, the Brahmins of Jagannath wrote a letter in Sanskrit praising the East India Company Governor General, saying, till you came, we were suffering under the Marathas, who are Hindu rulers, as it happens. And now that you're here we hope that the city of Puri continues forever under British rule. But the moment the British start to seem more and more evangelical missionaries and that entire group, the Hindus also start becoming more and more aggressive. It's not necessarily street agitation or fighting. One memorable bit was about how Hindus, now they've come face to face with Christianity. They need to put Christianity into their worldview somewhere. And like the good old Brahmins of yore, where you hierarchize things, they basically say that Christianity is okay, but it's a bad thing. And the story they create is that the Hindu traditions were doing so well that all the Hindu souls were entering Devaloka, or heaven. As a result of this, there was nobody left in Yamaloka, or hell. And God is all about cosmic balance. You need balance in the world. And in order to restore cosmic balance, God invented Christianity so that some souls would be waylaid into hell. So they create space in their worldview for Christianity, but it's a negative space. So it's very clear that they've got some kind of tension over there. There are these missionaries traveling in North India who see these Ram Leela performances, where you have the flaming arrow that's shot at an effigy of Ravana, the villainous figure in the Ramayana. Except now that Ravana is dressed in the clothes of the English East India Company Governor General. So there's symptoms, there's some evidence that there's some kind of political activity happening. Then you have the press. You have, in the next phase, you actually have people writing in the press, articulating what are early proto-nationalist feelings. They also talk about religion, and they talk about how, at least, and this is one of the writers, there's this young 20-something-year-old called Bhaskar Pandurang, who says that under Islamic rule, even if we were sometimes forced to convert, if you converted, you at least gained something from it. But with the British, if we convert to Christianity, your racism prevents us from progressing in life. So what is the point of converting? And this was a point Hindus often made with missionaries. There was the first Protestant missionary was a Danish man called Ziegenbalg. And when he asked why none of the Hindus were converting, they said, look, if you're damned in our religion and damned in yours as well, what's the point of conversion? We'll just continue in our respective faiths. They would often argue that the missionary insistence that God had only created one way to him and one way to heaven simply could not hold true. As Ziegenbalg was told, there are so many races in the world. If everybody ends up in the same heaven, how are they even talking to each other? What are the diversity practices in heaven? Because it's not making sense to us. So the Hindu argument always was that we don't deny Christianity, but Christianity is one of several paths to God. God has created multiple paths, like a shopkeeper. Just as a shopkeeper or a grocer has multiple products on his table to invite different kinds of constituencies into his shop, God has also created multiple options for different races, different cultures, and different groups. And this attitude towards religion, the missionaries simply can't understand. They cannot understand this very loose idea that God has created multiple books and multiple paths, etc. They believe there's only one book, and that is where the aggression comes in. And with British rule becoming more and more of a problem, nationalism emerging, the book ends with Hindu nationalism, where nationalism is of course supported, but the idea of who constitutes the nation is defined separately and differently, where only Hindus are considered part of the nation, and everybody is these communities that exist very much, as guests in a Hindu homeland.
Yeah, great. How brilliant was that, right? I mean, that's terrific. It's always worth asking a historian to tell you a narrative of periods, and there you have in great clarity. Thank you for that. So I want to go back to the 1830s, right, and which you draw attention to. There's something quite significant happens with language, from Sanskrit to English, right? And the study of Sanskrit, Sir William Jones, Colebrook, this is when British institutions to study Hindu texts, it takes off in great seriousness. Institutions are set up, money is put in, Oxford chairs are set up in the study of Sanskrit and so on. Tell us a little bit about what's happening around that language and knowledge. production.
So Indians had a great appetite for English, partly also because once the English East India Company became rulers, it was a passport to gaining employment. So there's this anecdote about how there was apparently one street in Madras that had hundreds of coaching centers for English. We still have them in our country. We still have coaching centers for English because English promises upward mobility. It promises opportunity. You're able to move up in life. But what the English couldn't understand from the 18th century onwards was that Indians had this great appetite for English and they had this great interest in jobs under the British. But once they got those jobs and once they picked up the English language, they did not convert. On the contrary, they used the money they were earning to build more temples, which the British couldn't understand. And the other thing was they picked up the English language and they used English to articulate resistance. Along with English, they also got a whole baggage of political concepts, democracy, rights, this, that. And they found ways to stress their own agency and their own national identity. There's also an internal contradiction to this, which is that because Indian society had a hierarchy, marginalized Indians were also using English to stand up to upper caste Indians. So there's multiple things happening in parallel. What's also interesting is that 19th century Indians had this great fascination with Western science. They wanted science and technology and learning. I have this character in the book called Sarfoji of Tanjore, this fascinating South Indian prince who's, dissecting a dead body one moment, translating books into local languages another moment. He finds ways of translation that are quite innovative. For example, instead of just taking European textbooks and translating them into an Indian language, he says, let me place it in an Indian mold altogether. So there's this Kuravanji play format in which there's a fortune teller who comes and speaks to another character, and they discuss pilgrim sites and old Hindu epic stories, etc. But in Sarfoji's hands, it changes. When the fortune teller comes and the other lady basically says, can you tell me about the sacred sites, etc., she says, no, let me tell you something else. And she gives a geography lesson about Moscow and Africa and America. So, strangely, Australia is not included. I don't know why, but all the other continents of the world are covered. Meanwhile, while a class of Indian intellectuals is hankering for English, is hankering for Western knowledge, but at the same time respect their religion and want to hold on to it, Europeans in India of the William Jones generation are fascinated with Sanskrit. They think that India's heyday was in the ancient period, so they romanticize the ancient period. There's also a religious element to it, where they think that contemporary Hinduism of temples and idol worship and all of that is bad Hinduism. Good Hinduism was what was in the scriptures or the Vedas of the Brahmins, very esoteric, very philosophical, some kind of monotheism, something Europeans can recognize. In fact, there were some Europeans who also believed it was a corrupted version of Christianity that Hindus originally had, to which Hindus would argue, saying that actually yours is a corrupted version of Hinduism. So the Europeans were in love with ancient India, and they were engaging in these huge translation projects, but again with their own politics. For example, William Jones translates the great Sanskrit Shakuntala, Abhijnana Shakuntalam by Kalidasa. But in the process of translation, he also brings in some of his own cultural conditioning. For example, there are bits where Shakuntala is described as sweating, and he says, no, this is too sensuous for a Western audience, so I'm going to redact this section and translate a Shakuntala who doesn't sweat. Where her breasts are described, he says, no, not for my Western audience, so she has no breasts as far as William Jones is concerned. And the irony is, it is this translated English Shakuntala who then gets pumped back into Indian textbooks in English, and then we've internalized it. And Indians also become more prudish as a consequence of this. And it's not just literary stuff, right? I come from Kerala, where as recently as the 1940s, women and men walked around topless. And the British couldn't understand this. They thought, there was this male gaze where they thought women walking around topless was somehow a very, very bad thing. So they brought in the blouse. And of course, most upper caste women did not want the blouse because they thought that wearing the blouse actually objectified their bodies. And they were drawing in sexual attention to their body by covering it up. Whereas if you were a dignified woman, you'd have no reason to cover your body. We have a half Irish, half Malayali Kerala writer called Aubrey Menon, whose Irish mother came to Kerala and was invited by the mother-in-law, the Indian mother-in-law, to come and meet her. And apparently the maidservant came running back saying that your daughter-in-law is sitting there completely covered up. And the mother-in-law said, she must be preparing for adultery, because only adulteresses would cover their bodies and their breasts. But because of the Western gaze, you slowly start seeing in paintings these elite women start holding a cloth against their breasts. After a while, they start wearing these high-necked blouses. The artist Ravi Varma, because of the English influence, where goddesses in temple idols as well as temple sculptures are topless to this day, he starts painting his goddesses with these high-necked, long-sleeved Victorian blouses. In fact, now if you go to South Indian temples, you'll start seeing these idols or images of goddesses where they've started draping them with fabric to cover up their topless upper bodies. So it's come into Hinduism in that way as well. So it's a strange sort of interaction taking place where the West, where the colonizer, in order to keep India under control in the present, exalts the past and completely dismisses the present, saying you need us to civilize you or at least take you back to your ancient standards. The Indians have no doubt that their present is okay. They're okay with it. They want to reclaim agency, but ironically, they need the English language for it, and they need an arsenal of concepts that comes partly from the West, and they need Western science and technology. So both groups are playing a great deal with each other, and nothing goes according to plan.
Lovely. Can you, in that context, just finish that story and tell us what happens with the revivalist, reformist movement within Hinduism as a result?
So I examined three trends, essentially. The first is from Bengal, Raja Ram Mohan Roy and that entire set, who create, they faced with missionaries who are arguing that you Hindus are sacrificing animals to your gods are running around with, like Krishna and his gopis, they're romantic and they've got carnal instincts. When you worship Shiva, you're worshipping a phallic image and this is not kosher, this isn't acceptable. So people like Ram Mohan Roy are aggrieved by this.
But he also came to England with a cow.
He came to England with a cow.
Which
As a
I
good
didn't
Brahmin,
know.
he wanted Indian milk, so he carried a cow with him.
Good detail.
There is a story he fathered an illegitimate child in Bristol, so that was okay, but you needed cows. I'm going to get sued for this in India, I'm pretty sure. This was a joke for the cameras. Okay, so Ram Mohan Roy, what he does is, he at one level internalizes the Western framework. The Protestant argument in the West is that there was a kind of pristine Christianity of the Bible. The Catholic Church, over a period of time, due to all kinds of cultural accretions, corrupts that pristine Christianity. And then you have the Protestant Reformation, which is back to the Bible, back to purity, back to a kind of scriptural, seriousness. That's the framework that the Westerners have. Ram Mohan Roy borrows this framework and applies it to Hinduism. He says, first we had the Vedas. Now, of course, the early part of the Vedas talks about multiple gods. So that's not good enough for him. He focuses on the Upanishads, the section which is philosophical, more monotheistic, and therefore fits his requirements. And he's very open about it. He says that all of this reform is also a political project, quite transparently. So he says, just like you had the Bible, we had the Vedas. Then just as the Catholic Church corrupted Christianity, the Brahmins corrupted Hinduism into temple worship, which is actually not how it unfolded historically, but that's the interpretation he gives it. And just as you in the West had the Protestant Reformation, we now need a Hindu Reformation. And he plays the role of a modern Martin Luther for India. And he's often described as the Luther of India. In the process, of course, his language against Hindu gods like Krishna and the goddess, etc., is exactly the same as a missionary. There's no difference there. Except that his argument is that in giving up temple worship, in giving up idol worship, you don't need to go to the Bible, you just need to go back to the Vedas. So again, just as Dave Nobili said, you can practice all of Hinduism till this point and then move to the Bible, Ram Mohan Roy does it in the reverse. He said, everything's fine till here, now you move to original Hinduism of the Vedas. That's one kind of reform. And to this day, the kind of intellectualized version of Hinduism is that version of Hinduism. Then there's another kind of Hinduism, which is muscular Hinduism on the ground, which the person I've studied is this figure called Dayananda Saraswati. He was born in a Brahmin family on the other side of India. Ram Mohan Roy is in Bengal, this guy is in Gujarat. He grows up and there's this one Shivaratri, which is this night where in a Shiva temple, you keep vigil. You're not supposed to doze off. All the adults in the group doze off, but the teenage boy is sitting there, and he's decided to keep his eyes open. And somewhere in the middle of the night, he notices that there's a little mouse that comes into the sanctum and starts feeding on the stuff or the food that's been left around the deity. And he says if the deity can't protect himself from a rodent, clearly the stone isn't God. So he then leaves home, and his parents are very paranoid. They catch him and bring him back. Of course, they're also, the moment he starts asking questions, like good Indian parents to this day, they think that the antidote to this is to get him married, and they try to find him a bride. He runs away properly this time, never goes back, and becomes a wandering saint. He tries all kinds of things. He tries to find these fabled hermits and sages in the Himalayas, but he's not happy when he finds them, because some of them have very performative quirks. There's one who has a habit of talking to spirits at night, and he's not very convinced by this. He tries to consume marijuana and bhang, thinking that will elevate his mind to another level and give him some answers. It doesn't work. Finally, of course, he finds a guru and he realizes it's again back to the Vedas. But a different format from Ram Mohan Roy. He essentially of course denies idol worship, etc. But he's not come into contact with any missionaries so far. It's in Calcutta that he meets the missionary. It's there that he discovers that Europeans are also writing about Sanskrit and they're writing about Indian scriptures. He starts to slowly understand what they're saying. And he eventually realizes that having a book is very helpful. So he writes a book of his own called the Satyarth Prakash. There's some interesting elements in it. For example, in traditional Indian mythology, you have the concept of Patala, the netherworlds, which he interprets as America, which is quite interesting. All the modern technology of the world, of course, originated in the Vedas. This is an appetite. We still have an appetite for this among very hardcore Hindus. That everything good in the world, of course, emerged from India and from Hinduism. There's also that old Sanjeev Bhaskar video somewhere on YouTube where everything is Hindu or everything is Indian. But the more important thing is he realizes that having an intellectual argument isn't enough. You need to mobilize people. So he first tries to get the Indian Hindu princes to put in the money and the capital to develop a kind of modern Hinduism. It doesn't go very far. Then he sets up an organization called the Arya Samaj. And what's interesting is it models itself on missionary organizations. So just as missionary organizations have missionaries going out and converting people, the Arya Samaj has missionaries going out and reconverting people to Hinduism. So you catch them and bring them back into the Hindu fold. Hinduism typically doesn't have conversion rites, but the Arya Samaj invents a form of conversion that's possible. Of course, people misuse this. There was a Maharaja in Baroda who wanted to marry a married woman, but because divorce wasn't allowed, Sita Devi of Baroda apparently converted to Islam, by which her existing husband automatically severed the connection. She then went to an Arya Samaj center, reconverted to Hinduism, and became the wife of the Maharaja of Baroda. And then came off to Europe with all of his jewels and gems, and led a very interesting life. And the third one is, of course, reform within Hinduism, which is Jyotiba Phule, which is, while, of course, Ram Mohan Roy and Saraswati, etc., are interested in creating this broader Hindu identity, the missionary argument, especially against caste and social inequality, is also used by leaders of marginalized groups to assert their own political individuality. So figures like Jyotiba Phule weaponize the missionary critique. They're also not interested in conversion. Jyotiba Phule always stops one step short of conversion. He's okay with other people converting, but he doesn't endorse conversion. But he uses missionary language to excoriate upper caste Hindus and says that if you want a kind of pan-Indian Hindu identity, it cannot happen while there is inequality within. For him, the enemy is not so much the white man, it's often the Brahmin that he sees as the enemy, because the Brahmin has control over Hindu society. And he sort of sets off this anti-caste argument within Hindu society, which Hindu nationalists and the intellectual Hindus are very uncomfortable with, again to this day. So it's again a story of contradiction. When the book ends, it's actually not with one grand answer, but a series of questions and a series of puzzles that we're still grappling with. But because at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about how religion and religious identities are malleable and dynamic, the point is, they will continue to evolve, and maybe by the end of our lifetimes, it will have a very different shape altogether, and you'll need a different book for that.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So we have about 15 minutes to take questions from the audience. If you raise your hand, I'll make sure. So we have a question right up in front, please, and then at the back.
Hi,
Just keep them short.
To your view, do you think the contemporary Hindu imagination is becoming more hyper-masculine or hyper-aggressive, as opposed to being more cultural? Because off late I came across this visual of Lord Ganesha being all jacked off and having six-packs, and that's not how I knew him growing up. So what's the answer to that?
Yeah, these aggressive forms of Hindu gods have been appearing as stickers on the back of cars and things like that. There's also very angry Hanuman that you see on the back of cars. The thing is, yes, there is a kind of hyper-masculinization, and that stems from Hindu nationalism. It feels there has to be an aggressive face to Hinduism. That Hinduism, the romanticized version of its pluralism and the many layers, etc., it's all very nice, but when you have enemies at the door, you need a much more regimented version of Hinduism. So it's a Hindu identity that feels that it's constantly under siege, especially from monotheistic religions, and therefore needs to evolve this hyper-masculine avatar. But I would not overstate it for the simple reason that this is very shrill, right, in the way it's done. And anything that's that shrill, to me, also signals a certain insecurity, which is that if you need to be so loud and so pushy and so aggressive in the way you sell something, clearly something is amiss. You realize there's something that's not fully rounded here, and you're trying to sort of paper over that. So while there is a hyper-aggression and there is a hyper-masculinization of Hinduism, I don't think that encapsulates the whole thing. I think it is a loud voice, it is present, but it's not the sum totality of what the modern Hindu identity is about. I think even now there are committed Hindus who do resist that hyper-masculinization.
Thank you. The gentleman at the back.
Hi, Manu. Fabulous session, as always. See, Abhi, the bit that I was very curious to know, and I told you I've not read the book, so I'm looking, I don't know if it's covered in that, but, this whole thing of, there's an element of Christianity that came in where, the Virgin Mary thing came from wanting to look at the goddesses and appropriate them as saying, oh, of course, this must be Virgin Mary. In the Hinduism context, isn't there, you said that Hinduism has not really done a lot of conversion originally, but this whole goddesses cult in South India, where you kind of said, oh, this must be, you make it either Shiva's wife or Vishnu's wife or Brahma's wife, and every goddess is appropriated into the Hindu religion. Buddha becomes the 10th avatar, right? So isn't there an element of conversion that was there anyway in terms of Hinduism?
So in the introduction to the book, I talk about how Brahmins sort of knit together all of these diverse cults. And it's very interesting because it's not conversion in the sense we understand it, where you have to give up certain practices altogether and then come on and there's a clean new slate or whatever. It's a compromise formula where certain aspects of the Brahminical fare are accepted and certain aspects of the local fare also have to be accepted. So it's a kind of mix and match, which is why there's no standard for it. In different parts of India, Hinduism has very different practices. As a South Indian, for example, when I go to North India and see people going and touching the Shivlingam, it's shocking because we never do that in the South, right? You have no access to the image of the deity. Small rituals and practices like that. In major temples, you'll find rituals that incorporate all kinds of people. In Srirangam, I forget the name of the temple. It's a goddess temple, where of course you've got the Brahmins inside in the main sanctum, etc. But in the middle of the afternoon, I saw a ritual featuring a cow. A person brings in a cow. They call the person the Amman, which is of course a female designation, but it's actually a man wearing a sari, and he performs a certain ritual around this cow, and it's pin drop silence till the ritual is done, and then everybody goes and touches the cow or whatever. That's clearly not a Brahminical tradition, and yet it has space within the Brahminical temple, right? So it's a kind of mix and match rather than conversion that's taking place when Hinduism or Brahminical culture spreads across India, where it's a give and take and a compromise formula.
Thank you.
Manu, you spoke about
where are you?
women. Yeah, you spoke about women in Kerala being topless, and that was like kind of a way of living. And there is this whole term about breast tax for lower caste women coming up. Is that like a false narrative, the whole breast tax?
It's a misunderstood narrative, which is that it wasn't just women of marginalized communities that were prevented from covering their breasts. Nobody covered their breasts. There was an Italian traveler who came in the 17th century to the court of the Zamorin of Calicut in Kerala, and he walked into court and found that there were these princesses walking around with blue silk waistcloths and like beautiful jewels and all of that, but no garments on their upper bodies. And the princesses came and studied him, thinking, why on earth is this man so covered up? Because they couldn't understand why in a hot country he was wearing a long tunic or whatever it was. So everybody is walking around topless. It's just that after a period of time, as the blouse came in, yes, at that point it was only marginalized women who continued to be topless. The critical thing is upper caste women, even when they were topless, they had access to a kind of shawl, which you loosely threw over your shoulder, not to cover your breasts. I have pictures of my great-grandmother who's got the shawl on one shoulder. Her other breast is completely exposed. So she's not using the shawl to cover herself. It's just a mark of status. That was denied to women of marginalized castes, which has been misunderstood by people who assume that lower caste women are not allowed to cover their breasts. Nobody was covering their breasts as recently as the 1960s even.
Can I add a little anecdote on blouses and saris, since I wrote a book about this, and women. When Nehru was Prime Minister, he went to one part of India where women still, quite sensibly, didn't wear blouses. They wore a sari wrapped around their bodies. But this was thought vulgar for the first Prime Minister of India to witness. So women were given blouses. When Prime Minister Nehru arrived, all these women had worn them as hats around their head because they had no idea what to do with these things, these stitched garments. So this is the kind of
In fact,
incomprehension.
we have a
of
similar
victim.
story in Kerala where there was a social reformer who thought he was going to make all the Malayali women chaste. So he said, I'm going to have a procession of women in blouses. So he had a procession of women. This could be an apocryphal story, but I've heard this from multiple sources around Thrissur, where they say he had this procession of women wearing blouses. And such a large crowd of people, men and women, gathered for this very novel picture of women in blouses, that the women in blouses got self-conscious, tore off their blouses and ran away. So we had the...
An even better story.
The Maharaja of Travancore was told by the British that when the British resident comes to court, he's very upset to see all these topless palace maids walking around, so they need to wear blouses. So the Maharaja said, fine, they have to wear blouses. But the first thing the women did when they exited the palace gate was to take off their blouses because they didn't want anyone to see them in blouses. And the final bit, my own great-grandmother, she was middle-aged in her 40s. When her second daughter got married, the husband's family brought her a brauka, or a long-necked, a full high-necked blouse as a present. And she wore it, admired herself in front of the mirror, and they said, why don't you go out now and show your brothers and your family, etc., your new garment? And she said, how can I go out in front of my father and brother wearing a blouse? So off it went, and she went back out.
Bring back those days.
She said it.
I say it as, the most uncomfortable aspect of wearing a sari is to wear the stitched blouse. So actually, we'd be saved if we didn't have to wear blouses. But there's another...
I have two questions.
Where are you?
Yeah, I'm over here.
short and one question.
Yeah, sure. I'd like to know about the role of political atheism in India during Hinduism's encounter with Christianity. And secondly, you were talking about how different cultural practices within India were brought into Hinduism. Is it also an endorsement of the claim that Dalits were essentially Hinduized, which is being constantly made by Dalit movements across the country?
On the second question, there is some truth to that claim, in the sense that one can't say Dalits were not part of Hindu society, but they were very much on the peripheries. For example, there's a scholar called Joel Lee. Look up his book. He talks about how in North India, in certain Dalit communities, they existed on the margins of Hinduism and had a lot of practices that were also Islamic in nature. And it's in living memory that they gave up names like Rahim for Ram. So they also had Muslim names, but the Arya Samaj, the RSS, etc., have been increasingly bringing them into the fold. Tribal communities in the northeast, in our forest belts, etc., they have very local traditions, but these local gods are now reinterpreted as avatars of Hindu gods, etc. That is a way of getting these groups on the peripheries into the mainstream, as it were. So there is some truth to that claim, but it's not entirely black and white. And I've forgotten your first question. Political atheism, in the early 19th century in Calcutta, there was a very strong group of atheists. In fact, atheistic enough to go and throw beef into the yards of Brahmins and things like that. In fact, there's a book, I forget the name of the author, but there's a new book that just came out 3 or 4 months ago on this particular group of people. I think it's called Young Bengal. You'll probably find more information in that book.
So, hi Manu, it's a bit of a futuristic, ambitious question really. So as a historian, do you think artificial intelligence will influence our religious identities, and will it change the way we look back on the history of our religious identities?
I'll tell you one thing. People, especially NRIs or Indian expats who are living overseas, I've seen families, especially in the South, I have relatives who've done Hindu rituals. So they send the money to the priest who sits in front of a camera in front of his computer and turns on Zoom and then performs the ritual for them. And then these guys sit in America in their proper Hindu clothes in front of the camera. And this happens across screens. So technology has a way of affecting religion. We know there's a scholar, I think at Cambridge or Oxford, called Maria Mishra. And I often talk about her book, Vishnu's Crowded Temple, where she has this one interesting detail about how when the railways first came in, the Brahmins were against it. They thought the fire carriage was evil and sin, and you'd lose caste if you traveled on it, etc. Or your souls would get stuck because of the speed at which you were traveling. But the moment they realized that because of the railways, you could go from Calcutta to Puri in 12 hours instead of traveling by foot for weeks or days, it actually ended up increasing pilgrim traffic. The coffers of the temple became fuller. The priests had more business. And Hinduism really managed to sort of gain a sort of further impetus because of the railways there. So I think technology has a way of reorienting religion, and religions are able to make the most of technology. I can't predict what AI will do for religion, but I can also already see people using AI to sort of create images of Hindu gods in all kinds of interesting ways. You don't know what that might set off.
I can tell you AI is not going to write good books as good as this one, or indeed several historians at this festival
So we often talk about North India and South India, and we understand what that means. How did that concept evolve historically? Was it culture, religion, empire, or a combination of everything?
I think geography plays a very important role in history in general. Towards the south, because it's a peninsula with water on all three sides, and because you have access to other parts of the world through trade, etc., and not necessarily invasions, etc., your historical experiences are somewhat different from maybe the landlocked north. So that's why I said the experience of Islam in the north is not necessarily the same as the experience of Islam in the south, or the forms that Islam itself takes in northern India and southern India. Geography also determines the political institutions that are formed in places. Kerala, where I come from, has 44 rivers or something crisscrossing the place. You never had strong centralized states over there until the 18th century, when one strong centralized state emerged, and that too just about barely a centralized state, because geography wouldn't allow for a centralized state. So power was much more fragmented, much more loosely held, and that has historical consequences. So at a broader level, yes. In fact, William is sitting here. He wrote a book called The Golden Road, right? And you see how South India and those maritime networks, suddenly South India isn't just a part of India, it's part of a broader kind of zone. We've now put it in that Indian sort of categorization, but in reality, if you look at it from the maritime perspective, it's a part of a broader kind of ecosystem, and maybe that's the categorization we should be going for. So I think there are cultural consequences because of geography and things like that.
Okay, one final question, Manu. Then.
Hi, Manu. So you said quite interestingly that you don't think Savarkar writing the book forged the modern Hindu identity. And I think that's, completely reasonable. What do you think are some of those seminal moments that impacted on forging the modern Hindu identity?
Savarkar's book was an important moment because he was able to finally articulate in a way that has endured what Hindutva and what Hindu nationalism means. He wasn't the first person to try it. Before Savarkar, Tilak, for example, tried to define Hindutva or Hindu nationalism. And he defined Hindutva along religious terms. He said you need to believe in the Vedas, you need to worship the cow, you need to believe in multiple paths to God, not just a single path. And that is how you define a Hindu. But the problem is there are also Hindus who don't believe in the Vedas. There are also Hindus who don't venerate the cow. So there were a whole bunch of Hindus left out of the definition as a consequence. So his Hindutva did not fly. But what Savarkar does is he removes religion from this altogether and he makes it much simpler. He says you need to have your holy land in India, so all your sacred sites have to be in the Indian subcontinent and you have to be of Indian descent. Ticking one box alone won't work, you have to tick both boxes simultaneously. So he creates Hindutva in its lasting mold. So that was definitely a very, very important moment. In terms of the broader moments over the last 1,000 years, I think the encounter with political Islam was an important moment in the early creation of a kind of political Hinduism, a sense that there is an us and them that can be articulated that way. Then, of course, the colonial experience, an encounter with colonial frames of thinking, which Hindus were able to appropriate, weaponize and use against the colonizer. And then, of course, Hindu nationalism. And the story is still being written. So we don't know what the next will be.
Okay, there is one more question, if you don't mind. Hold it.
Yep, great session. Thank you for a lot of laughter as well as knowledge. My question is that you spoke about a lot of Hinduism and religion. And Dr. Shashi Tharoor's book is also that Hinduism is a way of life. And there are no scriptures, right, which talks that there are do's and don'ts, that are commandments. So when you talk about conversions and religion, is it something that you were saying that Brahmins and there's a certain set of this particular area that the conversions were happening, is it to a way of life or was it a set of rules or what is it that you were discussing?
You mean Brahmins bringing people into the fold?
Yeah, you were saying that conversions are happening, right, in terms of Hinduism. And my question is that Hinduism is not a set religion as in, right? Like Tharoor's book, it's a way of life. So just
the way of life is again that slightly romanticized way of putting it. And as a believer, you're allowed to believe that. Because again, when you're talking about religion from the perspective of faith, that's a very different conversation. But when you're examining religion as a historical process and its evolution, you study it from a very different perch. So it's valid both ways. I'm not going to go and pick fights with believers about what they believe, because that's a very different set of arguments altogether. In terms of conversions, I'm not entirely clear what you were referring to. I think if it's the original Hinduism, the idea is not that people were being converted. It is that Brahmins were creating a framework into which diverse kinds of people could be slaughtered in certain ways. If it's the modern movements, like the Arya Samaj, etc., which are bringing people into the mainstream, as it were, that has elements that have been actively borrowed from missionary strategies. So watching how the missionaries were converting people, they were able, Arya Samaj, etc., were able to pick that up and actually use it in terms of reasserting a kind of modern, muscular Hindu identity or a homogenized Hindu identity. So of course, these things also still have their contradictions around caste and all of that. But yeah, people often borrow weapons sometimes from their oppressor and use it for their own purposes.
Yeah.
There's always a difference between Hinduism and Hindutva.
One final thing, sorry, I can't, we're out of time. And I just wanted to raise one small point, Manu, about your book. You know, see, somebody like J.P.S. Oberoi has written this argument about Sikhism being a truly modern Indian religion because it is in reaction to both medieval Hinduism and medieval Islam. You don't really talk about Sikhism much, do you, in your book? Was that a conscious choice?
I was tempted, but the thing is, this book was already overlong, and there's only so many things you can cram into a book. For example, lots of people have also asked me about why I don't talk more about the Hindu-Muslim encounter. The frank truth is, there was actually also a Muslim-Christian missionary encounter, and it's fascinating the way the Muslims also dealt with the missionary and saw the missionary as a threat. I did a lot of research on it, but frankly, it was tough to squeeze all of that into this book. That requires a separate book. But having written this book, I'm not the person to do the other book.
Yes, that's the book you're writing next year.
No,
this
I'm
is
too
what
exhausted.
we'll discuss when you've rested. Thank you very much, Manu.
Thank you again. And thanks, Mukulika.